My name is Bahman Mirshab. I'm Dean, College of Management. Before I give the podium to our president, I would like to mention that College of Management is the second oldest college of this institution. It was formed in 1939. It offers 2 degree programs in information technology and business. And just recently, we received the highest accreditation a business school can earn. It is accreditation by AACSB International. Less than 6% of universities worldwide are accredited. That being said, we are the only college which has 3 levels of accreditation in this region. Having said that, I would like to thank our provost, Dr. Maria Vaz. A few faculty of the college are here, and I'm going to ask President Modgil to give his welcome. Thank you very much. President Modgil.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Dean. Ladies and gentlemen, many of you have been here before, and we're delighted you come back because it's a great platform for executives and those who aspire to be executives, and many those who aren't should be. We are now at a stage at Lawrence Tech since our founding in 1932 at Henry Ford's Model T plant that the college was basically known as engineering school, but we are really a comprehensive university with 4 colleges: architecture, engineering, college of arts and sciences, and business. Dean just mentioned they just received the 3rd category of accreditation, which is the most coveted accreditation. So I hope many of you will note that. From the initial beginning, theory and practice has led the university to be distinctive, to be a differentiator. Regardless of whatever students learn, they must practice it. Even in sociology, in humanities, engineering, architecture, in business, they must work with a professional if they're not making manufacturing. I think this allows our students to be well trained, and they are wanted. For example, 90% of our students have jobs in the back pocket before they go to commencement, and they haven't finished yet because of the nature of training they received. And I know some of our students work for your companies, and I get good feedback. And if it's otherwise, I'd like to know so we can fix it. So with this, I think we have a roster today, and they will be introduced later. 2 legendary individuals, leaders, executives, who run companies, and their families and personalities have been impactful in the city of Detroit in economic, social, and cultural advancement of city of Detroit. And they had large impact on the city through their contribution and through the businesses and leadership. I think you have a treat to listen to. With that, please enjoy, and thank you for coming.
Morning, everybody. I know you're used to me doing the introductions, but you're lucky today I'm not going to be doing them. We actually have Thanks, Scott. We actually have a special guest today. Jim Proppe, the Plant Moran's firm managing partner, is here today, and he's going to do the introductions of our 2 speakers. So, Jim?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure being here with you today. It's an honor to be able to do these introductions here, so appreciate the opportunity, John. Our first speaker, or speakers, first will be Scott Landry. And Scott's going to provide us with the CEO's perspective around transition. And he's had the opportunity to live it because I think it was 3 years ago when you became the 13th CEO of the YMCA of Metropolitan Detroit. So he's lived it. He can help us understand it. Over his 24-year career with the Y, Scott's also served as the CFO and COO. So you had some transitions even while you were there, it sounds like. He's restructured the YMCA's finances and operations and has planned and overseen a number of capital projects. And he's got some real interesting stories there that we were chatting about earlier this morning. Prior to joining the YMCA of Metropolitan Detroit, Scott spent 7 years as the CFO of the YMCA of Greater New Orleans. So he's a transplant into this area. He's also president of the YMCA Foundation. So welcome, Scott. Presenting with him will be Jim Nicholson. Jim's going to provide us with the board perspective around succession planning. He's currently the president and CEO of PVS Chemicals and also holds executive roles in 5 subsidiary companies with operations around the country. He has experience with a number of not-for-profit boards. That's probably the understatement. He's been on a number of not-for-profit boards and has been involved with 3 CEO transitions relating to that. Serves on the board of directors for the American Chemistry Council, the board of trustees of the College for Creative Studies, the Nature Conservancy, and Citizens Research Council of Michigan. So those are just current positions. And in the past, he's been the chair of the Junior Achievement of Southeastern Michigan, the YMCA of Metro Detroit, and Michigan Manufacturers Association. So let's give a warm welcome to both Jim and Scott.
I think we need to be mic'd because they're recording this. But let me give you first of all, thank you to Lawrence Tech. Thank you for Plant Moran. The Y has rich history with both organizations. We're a 23-year client of Plant Moran. Sue Perlin is somewhere in the audience and showed up on our doorstep back in 1994. Ever since then, the transition has gone downhill. John Bibas actually was our partner for a while, and we survived that. But anyway, a little tidbit, and I promised I would speak very briefly about this, but for quite a period of time, the YMCA brought education to the masses in Detroit, including founding the Detroit College of Law, which is now Michigan State, the School of Law up at Michigan State. But we also founded an institution called the Detroit Institute of Technology, which existed for quite a period of time. And that institution, over a period of time, transitioned and became Lawrence Tech. So we have a rich, deep history with both organizations. Let me very briefly explain to you kind of the background of why it's kind of neat for us to be here and introduce the third member of our team. The gentleman sitting down, who adds a lot of age to the presentation group, is it's a joke. They're going to come fast and furious, okay? I realize this should be a dry topic, but anyway. So the gentleman sitting down right here is Reed Tebow. Reed was my predecessor, 20-year CEO of the YMCA in Detroit. Jim and I asked if he would come, and he agreed to come. And that would be pretty cool. You got the previous CEO and then a transition to the current CEO. But in addition to that, Reed is also incredibly well-read and well-written on many things governance, not-for-profit. So Reed actually committed to writing our CEO transition process, our CEO evaluation process, presided over 2 changes to our bylaws. So it's a guy who can probably answer a lot of questions, okay? Jim Nicholson presided over this change. So Jim has done this 3 times in 3 completely different not-for-profit situations, the most recent being the one that took us from Reed to me. So you've got the previous CEO, 20 years, you've got the guy who presided over the change, and you've got the current CEO. So that puts us in a little bit of a strange situation. So not-for-profit governance. Not-for-profit CEO transition, you probably start thinking about this as you're a board member when a CEO walks into your office and says, remember I told you I was going to retire in 3 months. Or when a CEO walks into your office and says, I have a significant health issue, I need to move to Arizona next week. Or worse yet, when the accounting firm walks in and says we're out of cash. That's usually when you start thinking about CEO transition, right? What we're going to hope to do is give you some tools that help you think about this on an ongoing basis. So one of the things you really need to start thinking about is how this at the Y is part of our DNA, which is why we're 167 years old, and it's why when we transition CEOs, it's usually a pretty mundane process. There's no fireworks. You don't read about it in cranes. So here's what we're going to do today. Introduction, the presenters. We're going to talk a little bit about the why. I'm going to talk about the why not because I'm going to do the boring 20-minute beginning of the presentation conversation about how wonderful we are. I'm going to just give you a couple of facts about us so that you can start to understand why your organization is different than ours and how then you should begin to think about some of the things I'm talking about in terms of your organization, because you won't be like us. So you're going to have to adapt some of the stuff we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on who we are. We're going to talk to you a little bit about why we're pre-wired to be successful. So at our YMCA, we have certain characteristics that make the CEO transition process seamless. I'm going to describe them to you, many of which you probably can begin to bring into your organization. Jim's going to get involved and start talking about the details. And one of the things we have is we start with an approach. And again, it's institutionalized. We kind of know where we're going to go before we even start going down a road. Going to take you through the process, what we actually do. And then talk a little bit about the transition. So CEO's been selected, and what happens next. The final line up there behind me refers to an organization called BoardSource. The most important thing you could do today. I feel like a professor. Write this down. Except nowadays people probably bang it into a keyboard. There's an organization called BoardSource, boardsource.org. If you've never heard of them, this is an incredibly rich treasure trove of information, some free, some you pay for. BoardSource actually for the YMCA has done a wonderful book on CEO transition. We borrowed much of this information for our presentation, but BoardSource, wonderful, wonderful place for you to go to get some of this stuff, okay? So without further ado, here we go. One of us will trip because there's a little lump under the carpet here. You guys from LTU need to take care of that. That's our ugly faces. We didn't have time to put Reed's up there, but we were afraid you wouldn't come if you saw his. So talk a little bit about the YMCA. Currently in our 168th year of operation, 168th year. Why is that important? It's not that don't go, ooh, 168 years. We have wired into us a lot of things because we're this old. So organizationally, when we start to think, we have certain ways that we think. They evolve constantly. But understand, organizationally, as we're not making this stuff up as we go. A lot of this stuff literally was committed to us in the 1840s and 1850s, and much of it is institutionalized. So very old organization. We're a multi-conglomerate type not-for-profit. We do a lot of different things. We're in 8 hard facilities, 2 resident camps, and hundreds of non-facility locations throughout 4 counties in southeast Michigan. So we're a bit of a conglomerate. Again, why does that make us different? As we're looking for a CEO, we're looking pretty much for a business person. We're looking for somebody who can manage a business first and raise money, okay? If you're a single-purpose, not-for-profit, you may be looking for something completely different. We're almost a conglomerate of a not-for-profit. We are historically, as an organization, have involved volunteers. So within our organization, again, it's ingrained in our DNA that volunteers are part of our organization. They're part of our policy making, they're part of our program, they're part of everything we do. So again, if you're on a board and you got to start thinking about CEO transition and you've never really been involved with your CEO, that's probably going to create a problem. We at the Y have always been around volunteers and about volunteers. Again, part of our DNA. Our Y was run, there was not a paid staff person in our YMCA until sometime in the 1900s. So for the first roughly 70 or 80 years of our organization, it was entirely volunteer driven. YMCA leaders at the time were called general secretaries. So you heard that I am the 13th CEO of our Y in 168 years. There is a list of probably 70 not-for-profit volunteer leaders of our Y on a gavel box. So I'm reading our newfangled things within our Y. Volunteerism is there. We have a rich history of volunteer involvement. Henry Ford, Jim Nicholson's father, Ben Maybach, you name it, Stanley Kresge, have all been deeply involved in our Y. And our volunteers are heavily involved in policy setting. So almost anything we do, there's a volunteer involved in it. If we're going to do any long-term thinking, there's a volunteer involved in it. We have a rich committee structure. All of this that I've just said is a precursor to everything else I'm going to say. So everything up until now is a precursor to explain to you why our CEO transition goes well and maybe some things that you can incorporate into your not-for-profit. So clear, open communication between the CEO and the volunteers. Twice a year, I sit down with an evaluation committee. As a matter of fact, it's coming up next week. That's why I'm being so nice to Jim. A deep part of my evaluation committee is a pretty heavy discussion of my plans, not just my performance, but my plans. Am I long-term, am I short-term? If I'm short-term, what are we doing internally to create leadership transition? There's a general discussion anyway on what are we doing with our senior leaders and the why, and how are we building them up for their next job. Twice a year, ongoing communication. In addition to that, the CEO of our organization and the CVO are in constant communication. Jim and I got together probably once every 2 weeks for breakfast for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Talked about the why, talked about me, talked about where we were going. Constant ongoing communication.
And you're done. All right, Scott and I are pacers, so I apologize ahead of time if you notice us walking back and forth. So this is where the volunteer comes in, right? He used the acronym CVO. That means Chief Volunteer Officer. What you really are is the chair of the board, and it's a 2-year gig, right? And your most important role as a board, right? If you're a board member out here, your most important role is the selection of the CEO. Right? The CEO runs the business. But as a board member, understanding this process, it is the most essential part of your role, particularly in a nonprofit organization. So, to understand that, you've got to have a relationship with the CEO. You got to understand the CEO's plans, and you have to have open lines of communication. Scott talked about it from the organization side, right? From the volunteer side, it means that you're invested. Right? You've drunk the Kool-Aid. You are active. Right? You show up to the meetings, or at least most of them. Right? You know the organization. You know how it works. So again, Scott mentioned, right, the why is different than other folks. I see folks from some of the other organizations I'm involved in. Each organization's run differently. It has its own culture. Right? But if you're a board member of an organization, you better understand where the cash comes from and where the cash goes. Right? Because if you don't know that, you don't know how the business works, and you're going to have a hard time coming up with who is the next CEO. Staff-volunteer relationships. So I'm a firm believer that if you're on the board of an organization and the only person you ever talk to is the CEO, you are committing board malpractice. Right? You should know other people within the organization. Other people within the organization should know you. And they should be able to call you, right? And you should be able to call them, right? So if you have questions about the financials, you should be able to call the CFO and ask this question, right? And having strong relationships, yes. Good relationships with the people who work within the organization, especially the next group down from the CEO, are important because they are also a big part of the transition plan, right? Without their support, you potentially create a crisis. Next slide. So, if you're on the board, right, and you have a change of CEO, and we had a very long-standing, well-respected CEO in Reed, and Reed told us he was going to retire, we said as a board, and as the group that was involved in this process, you know, this is not only a issue to resolve, it's an opportunity, right? And so you need to understand this process is an opportunity. You can make serious change to an organization. I don't have anybody from Junior Achievement in this room today, but the Junior Achievement organization, when I was the chair, was really in life support mode, right? We were working to fix our balance sheet. Well, that was done by the time we had our transition change. And the board decided that growth was now the organization, needed a different kind of CEO than the one we had. So it's a good example of use the thing as an opportunity. Next slide. Okay. That said, you need to understand your legacy issues, right? If you have a lot of leverage, if you're tied to one key funding source, if you have a particular relationship with particular industries, right? All of these things matter especially if there's potential drama. Every new CEO has a real incentive to throw the old guy under the bus, so you better know what's going on and disclose it all so that you don't create some additional drama with the change. All right, so we talked about those legacy issues, right? Financial, right, and organizational, operational. Right? One of the great challenges, and I was talking about this the other day with some folks from nonprofits, is that the board typically hires a really capable person as CEO and then underfunds the organization in such a way that they really struggle to build a good team underneath them. And so understanding that organizational, operational issue is important, right? Because if your CEO is high performing and is doing the jobs of 6 people, right, that's a big issue for you in a transition. This is not a day-to-day activity in your world as the volunteer, right? If you are in part of this process, right, you can't treat this as sort of something you're kind of going to do when you have time, right? This is a real job. This is a luxury, right? If you have warning, this is fabulous, right? Sometimes you've got to rush. But in general, a good plan, bringing the group together, right? Herding volunteers is no mean feat, right? So you're trying to build consensus. Don't rush, right? The one thing that will get you the revolution on your board is if it appears that somebody is just driving the process to a conclusion without inclusion. Enlist outside help, right? So, again, if you're a board member, this is not your business, right? So if you need expertise and help, right, you can get it. The Y is very fortunate, right? The national Y has resources and folks who are in the business of helping the Ys across the country in-source leadership for those Ys. Now that said, you can hire a search firm or you can build your network, right? In the case of Junior Achievement and the last CEO search, right, we had a number of fabulous HR professionals on the board and we enlisted their help, right? But don't be shy about asking for help in this process. The process. So, if you have the nightmare process where you're almost out of cash, right, it's a different process than if you're doing a retirement. So, planned versus unplanned. There we go. What do we got here, Scott? Yep, these are the types. Yep. Right, so planned versus unplanned, right? Planned is fabulous, right? Gives you time to build consensus, right? Unplanned is exactly that, right? The problem with very capable nonprofit CEOs is they're around a whole bunch of capable for-profit CEOs who want to hire them, right? And they get poached more often than you think, right? There's a lot of psychic benefit to being a nonprofit CEO, right? But capable people get hired, right? Sustained success, this depends on your organization and how successful you are, what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you've got an underperforming organization, right? So if you've got an organization with a deep balance sheet hole and is not driving much surplus, if any, right? You have a different set of situations than if you have an organization that's generating some surplus and some assets and has some flexibility, because this is not free, right? When you make this transition, it is not free, right? Your organization's going to take a hit somewhere. Turnaround is exactly what it sounds like. First hire of an organization, that's where you're transitioning from the volunteer to having somebody actually run the place. That's a really challenging one, right? Because it tends to be the person who has driven the organization to where it is now is starting to hand off the reins, but they won't really let go, and that's a tough hire. And then the hard to follow CEO, right? Hard to follow CEO, giant community presence, big personality. The whole place has been run to serve him for a long time, him or her. I've had both. These are different dynamics, right? And the hard-to-follow CEO requires some extra thinking on the part of your transition committee. What do we got next here? All right. So at the Y, we developed a committee group to work together on this process, and we started about communications plans and materials, right? So, you have a whole bunch of things. Scott's got a bunch of things. Throw up the next slide up there. So, look, the board needs to know first, but you can't have it be a giant surprise to staff. Staff has probably figured it out already, right? If you have any organization with any kind of competent rumor mill, they know. They've read the tea leaves. They've seen the coffee cup has moved from its usual spot to a different spot, and they've decided that this is what this means. This happens all the time, right? But proper etiquette, make sure your staff knows, right? But here's the key, right? And this is something the board has to do before it really gets out in front of the communication process is decide who's in charge of the transition, right? And that's always the board. But within the board, right, if you're like the Y, we have 50 people on our board. A 50-person committee is not a committee. Right? So the board needs to invest, and this is a sort of my cardinal rule number one, right? Board needs to decide on a transition committee and invest in that committee, the authority to make this hire.
So, Jim, another document we have for you. John Bibas told us come with documents. This is the announcement when I left from the then chair, Will Erkin, with an announcement which was written by a PR firm about Reed's impending retirement. By the way, if that's not done, that's when a rumor mill starts. That's when Cranes gives you a call and says, we understand Reed's leaving. Well, you want Cranes to find out because a PR firm sent them. That announcement's here. We've also got here the the commission that was given to the transition committee. So the actual commission that the board handed to Jim, who is leading that committee, and then that was part of a board resolution that was approved at a board meeting. So this was all done and announced in a September board meeting in September 2013. So you've got here all the documents that we did, to Jim's point, to make sure that when this finally happened, it happened the way we wanted it to happen and not the way the media wanted it to happen, or other people love to get involved in stuff like this in all the wrong ways. So another set of documents we've got for you.
So you got to make up your transition committee, right? So we can talk a little bit about it, and I can't remember if we did it on another slide or not here, but let's just talk briefly about the transition committee. Transition committee should be made up of the person that your new hire is going to work for, right? So your incoming chair. The current chair is generally going to be busy managing all of this other stuff, right? Board issues, employee issues, the departing CEO. That person who's the chair right then, and the Y has 2-year chair terms, right? But if you're in a nonprofit and you are on the chair, right, you should be managing the current situation, because the new guy or girl is probably not going to work for you for very long. They're really going to work for the next person. So that next person, right, it's 2 benefits. First benefit is that that person has a relationship because they're part of the hiring process. So whoever the incoming chair is going to have a relationship with the new person you hired. And the bigger benefit is the new person you're hiring knows who they're going to work for. right? If that's a giant mystery, that's a red flag for anyone who wants to switch jobs, right? People switching jobs take a risk, right? They want to know who they're working for.
So what's really interesting is one of the things we talked about when we started talking about the precursor for success. At the YMCA, we've got lined up the next several board chairs. So we know when I started to come in, we knew who the past chair was, who the then chair was. We knew who the next incoming chair was, which was Jim, and we knew who the chair was going to be after that. So we've got a transition which basically allows us to create a committee that has these people in it. We will get to a point with my leadership where we will start to understand down the road who will be the chair and who will be the incoming chair when that happens, so that this transition again occurs fairly seamlessly. So again, critical in our organization, we know our chief volunteer officer transition well down the road.
One guy does not make a committee, but 15 people also too many, right? So you've got to pick a number that's small enough to make it work. And you want to mix on your committee. You want a mix of ages and constituents. You want your board in particular to feel like the committee represents them well. Right? So canvassing your folks, figuring out who has time, because let me tell you, running the transition committee is a real job. Right? Nonprofit CEO jobs are popular. Right? They will attract hundreds of resumes. Right? The salaries are all in the 990s, so it's all online, so people know what this thing makes. And the reality is there's a lot of psychic income that comes with being part of a social service organization or organization that qualifies in that 501c3 status. Right? So there's a lot of folks who show an interest. So that means there's a lot of resumes to go through. Lots to filter, right? So you need people. Here we go.
Thank you. NWACS. Let me just quickly thank Lawrence Tech and Scott and Jim, Sue Perlin and John Bibas and the Plant Moran team for inviting us here today, and specifically Scott and Jim for inviting me. It's always nice to get an invitation, and now that I'm retired, free coffee and donuts are a real motivator. Just to add a bit on the transition committee, Jim emphasized a couple of times how critically important the job is, and how the chair of that committee has got to take that job extremely serious. It was very intentional that I asked Jim to chair this process because I knew he would fulfill that kind of commitment. And we also established that anyone who served on the committee had to attend all the meetings, not 75%, 100%. And if they didn't, particularly when it got to the interviews, they couldn't participate in the selection decision. And Jim brought that commitment and discipline to the process, and I think that's why we ended up with an excellent CEO. But in terms of the retiring CEO, and assuming this is a positive transition, I think maybe the most important is to be supportive of the new CEO coming in. I can't tell you how many casual conversations I had both internally and externally. You know, Scott's sure different than you. Well, yeah, a different person, a different background, a different set of experiences. But one thing we shared was a passionate commitment to have a successful YMCA serve the families and children of Southeast Michigan. So you're going to get that retiring CEO is going to have plenty of opportunities to say, yeah, I don't know why the committee selected that guy. I mean, certainly not what I would have done. Or to say nothing, which sometimes is a more powerful response than actually saying something. I think be available to the new CEO coming in. That retiring CEO, and in my case, I was with the wife for 46 years in different places in the country, and some 30 years as a CEO in Dayton, Ohio, and here in Detroit. So I had a lot of institutional memory. Even at my age now, I still have some of that institutional memory. And that's a tremendous resource to the organization, and be willing to provide that. I think the last, and when I asked Scott, what should I emphasize most, in a way that only Scott could do, said, tell him that the retiring CEO needs to stay the hell out of the way. Well, I think what he was really saying, or at least I'd like to think, is that, again, don't interfere. If you can't be supportive, don't get involved. Scott and I had an understanding that I was a phone call, an email, or a breakfast or lunch away. But I wouldn't, at least for a year, I wouldn't show up at the office. I wouldn't participate in any of the events. I would give him, and I think in our case, where we had worked together for some 20 years before I retired, it was particularly important. I wanted to make sure, and I'm sure Scott did as well, there was no question as to who the new CEO was. And I think that's an extremely important point to keep in mind if you're thinking about retiring and staying in the area.
We do most of our information sharing in bars on Thursday at 4 o'clock in Plymouth. So if you want wisdom about how to manage a not-for-profit, you can meet us as long as you provide one of the beers. Well, that's what you said, as long as they one or you all of them. Okay.
All right, so what does the transition committee need? The transition committee needs authority. Right, so there's a few things that are important, right? The transition committee needs to know what job they're hiring for. We talked a little bit about the different kinds of CEO hires, right? The committee needs to understand and agree on what they're looking for, right? In broad generalities. Now, have a real job description that you all agree to, right? You can't publish a job description that say, but what we really need is someone who can, start up a new school. Or, if that's not in the job description, it can't be in the evaluation process, right? Need to recruit a pool of candidates. The good news in not-for-profit CEO world is that the pool of candidates is broad. There are a lot of people who want to be in charge of an organization that does good, right? That is a human response, right? We need a point of contact with the folks in the organization, get questions answered, get information, right? You're the chief volunteer officer, not the guy who knows what the balance sheet of a particular branch looks like or what the issues are revolving around camp recruitment of staff, right? So you need to make sure that if you get a question that you as the committee can't answer, that you have a resource to be able to get those questions answered. Right. And we were very disciplined, right? So the chair of the committee took all the questions in, took all the questions out, and got the answers and then distributed them, right? Okay, so we could spend a lot of time on this, but our goal is to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. But the interview process, traditionally the committee does the following, right? We get a huge pool of resumes, we spread them out, we filter them, right? We get down to a group of typically around 20, right? There'll be a lot of conversation about the 20 as the group, right? We'll narrow it typically to between 10 and 6, and then between those 10 and 6, you're going to have a pretty extensive conversation and figure out who's coming in, right? And typically you're going to interview probably at least 6, maybe up to 10 folks, which is a giant time sink, right? So if you are on a CEO transition committee, you know this is a real job, right? If you're doing this job correctly, you are going to be doing a lot of interviewing.
Jim, one of the things I forgot to put in the PowerPoint is we have here also a CEO transition timeline, which is available to you. And all of the stuff that Jim's talking about is in here. And one of the things I think I really need to impress on you is this is, again, a generic timeline which starts on March 7th, 2017, and has the new CEO in the position, new CEO being made an offer in October to possibly be in a position in November. April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. 9 months, 8 months. I can't, John and tell you I can't count. I'm a CPA, but I can't count. 8 months, okay? So this is not a short process. The interview process itself, by the way, within this is almost a month and a half long, because you're going to reach out to people, you're going to interview them, you're going to cull down, you're going to have a second set of interviews. So, and you can't, if somebody's a successful CEO wanting to come interview in this job, they're not going to be able to respond on a week notice.
Right.
I can tell you the 2 questions that I got for each of those 2 interview processes, I needed to think a lot. I mean, it took me probably 2 weeks just to prepare responses for those 2 questions. We also have the sample questions up here too.
Yeah.
So months this process takes.
Just to talk briefly about the process, when you bring in the 6, right, you're going to bring in each of those for interviews. They're typically about a half an hour. You want to know about them. They want to know a little bit about you. Hopefully, most of the questions they have about you have already been answered by the chair of the transition committee. That chair has been talking to these folks, getting their questions answered, right? The process then is really trying to winnow it down to a top 2 finalist. Then you do go, in essence, your last round, right? Our last round as a process was we handed the top 2 candidates a couple of pretty tough questions about the future of the organization and how they would manage it, what their approach would take. We provided them enough time and access to the information to be able to answer those questions. We gave them access to the resources. Remember, this is a not-for-profit. This isn't like secret society, right? So we put them in there. We also, interestingly enough, in the final 2 candidates, had each of the candidates talk to anyone they wanted to in the organization, right? That creates a little bit of ruffled feathers in the organization, right? The organization gets nervous, especially if you've got an outsider as a potential candidate, right? And maybe you might have more than one outsider as a potential candidate. But, again, your organization is run day to day by its staff. And if the staff interview 2 or 3 people as part of this communication back and forth process, and one they truly hate, you as a transition committee chair need to be fully aware that if that's the person you select, you're probably going to be forcing that person to hire a whole lot of new people in your organization. You're talking about a very serious organizational change. The selection. So finally you choose one, right? This is almost always a 2-hour meeting, right? And it's lengthy and there's a lot of conversation back and forth. Your goal as the transition committee chair is to get unanimous consent behind a candidate, right? What can really undermine you is if you have someone on your committee who doesn't like your selection and starts to undermine it with the board, because hopefully in this process the board has granted the transition committee sole authority to offer one person. Let me repeat that. One person to the board for approval. You do not want, as the transition committee chair, to create a contest and an election on a 50-person board of people who've never met any of these folks, right? That's not a good strategy. The transition committee has in essence has the authority to hire with the board's approval. You make the offer, right? Hopefully it gets accepted. Ratified, you can do it. Typically, you make the offer. You make sure that whoever you want to hire is going to be ratified by the board. And the flip side is also true. Whoever you're offering to the board wants the job.
So again, as you're creating, by the way, it's kind of simple things, but important things. This entire process is built around board meetings. So the announcement And the first date of this is a board meeting, where the board knows for the first time officially that the CEO is leaving. The last date, well, not the last date, but one of the next critical dates is a board meeting where the board ratifies this. So this committee is meeting typically almost right before the board meeting and then rolling into one of our regularly scheduled board meetings for the ratification. So that, again, this has all been, when you do this schedule, you've got the board meeting in mind. So.
All right, then you announce, right? Make sure you announce to everybody all at once, right? Try to have as few insiders as possible, right? Because again, if you have an organization with any kind of competent rumor mill, it knows before you announce, right? But it's proper etiquette to make sure you get it out there. Yeah. I always start with the staff first, right? Staff are what makes your organization run. Then you got orientation onboarding. So if you have a good transition, right, and your departing CEO and your new CEO have created a relationship, create a conversation, create the relationship you just saw here, that is fabulous, right? But the board chair needs to be heavily involved, as does the incoming board chair, so that your new CEO feels supported in their process, right? Here's a big thing, right? You're on a nonprofit board, right? You're part of the fundraising, especially if you bring in someone who has limited fundraising skills or who hasn't spent a lot of time fundraising because your issues are operational as opposed to fundraising. You want to create the opportunity for relationships. So your board, and as the transition committee chair, I spent a bunch of time with this. You spend time first facilitating meetings with the board, with each of the person, with the new CEO, and then during those meetings you ask, you almost demand, that the person that you're meeting with gets somebody else in the community a connection to that CEO.
By the way, in that process, I had a list. I mean, Jim and I would sit down in one of our breakfast, and he would say, "You need to meet," and there was a list. And I literally, and then next to the person was a volunteer. Never went to those meetings alone. It was a name and a volunteer. Not 8 times, 9 times out of 10, it was Jim, but sometimes it was other board members. But that list, and I am an example of what Jim referred to. Although I'm not new to Detroit, I was certainly new to the CEO position, and I knew many of these people by distant relationship, but I did not have a relationship with them where I could pick up the phone, call them, and have a conversation with them. So
the CEO's the face of your organization. They're not out in public and they don't understand that. That's a big issue. And then let this new guy do his job, right? You've given him the authority, you've made it selections, right? And this goes back to what Reed and Scott said earlier, right? At the end of the day, you've hired someone, right? Your board job is done, right? Let the person do their job. Changes are going to happen, right? As Scott said, right? They're not the same person. You know, Scott worked for Reed for 20 years. Didn't mean that the change did not happen, right? We had plenty of change, right? We had some folks who decided they wanted to do something else, right? We had some folks that Scott decided he wanted them to do something else, right? And that's fine. That's his job. And it's his job to run the place. Our job as the board is to monitor his results, right? And don't go away, right? If you're the guy, especially if you're the leader of the transition committee, right? This person's expecting to report to you and work to you. You can't just sort of disappear. That's a real bad thing to leave somebody in lurch for. At this point, you should have created a relationship that is going to be reasonably lasting. Unfortunately, I have Scott. So, what else we got, Scott? I think we're trying to stay. We were trying to make sure we were ready for questions by 9:30. We both have a tendency to talk too much, but we are ready to have questions. Now, one of the things with questions was that we have folks, because they're recording this, they asked that the questions go into a mic. And I think I see 2 lovely ladies with mics.
And again, just to refresh everybody's memory, we've got lots of materials, so we can make
Yeah.
them available to you. Let us know.
So it sounds like you have a great process with the board to ensure transition and continuity and preparation and all of that. If Scott wins the lottery tomorrow, which I like a whole lot better than gets hit by a bus, what's your preparation for that?
Sure. So Scott referenced a little earlier on, we have a process where the CEO gives a review every 6 months. Reed deserves all of the credit for setting this process up. The process involves a few things, right? It's reviewing the CEO's performance, but it's also reviewing the CEO's evaluation of the people who work with him, right? To identify who is a potential candidate, who's going to be the interim person to run the place if the lottery is won or some other unexpected event happens. And that institutionally creates the situation of, okay, we have this person, they're a potential, but they have this gap and this gap and this gap, so what are you doing to fix it, right? And we put that back on the CEO to try to make sure that there is a process that's ongoing about making sure that staff has that skill set that they can step in till you can run your process.
Just to add to that, Jim, probably 25 years ago or so, I was in a conversation with a peer, CEO of another large YMCA, and I don't remember the context, but he asked me, how's your succession plan going? Well, I mean, I was 25 years younger than I am now, and I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I'd heard industry talk about it, and from my observation within the Y, many YMCAs selected a CEO where they want to change. And so regardless of how you prepared the organization, they would move in a different direction. So I really didn't have a high regard for succession planning in the Y. And the response that I got from the CEO was, you are failing miserably as the leader of your organization. And I was really quite taken back because I thought I was a pretty good CEO. And that caused me to start thinking in a broader sense, not just who would replace me, but the top leadership in the organization. And from that point on, as Jim mentioned, we started to create succession planning, not specifically who would replace me or anyone else, but preparing key staff in the organization to take a leadership role in some other YMCA perhaps. And so, for example, while I was doing that in Detroit related to the CEO role, Joanne Dunn, who at the time was our CFO, was preparing who would replace her. And that influenced her hiring and the kind of person that she recruited as her number 2 person. And as it turned out, Michelle is here this morning and she is the CFO. So it's really looking at all the key positions and making sure you've got staff in the pipeline who can assume those, hopefully in your organization, but in some other related organization.
So remember, I started off 160-something years pre-wired. You're beginning to understand now part of this pre-wiring. And again, I'm attorney, accountant, theoretical, practical. Let me here's another practical fact. A piece of my evaluation says CEO transition. It was there the day I took the job. Identify an internal candidate, identify external local candidates. So I report to them every 6 months on who's the most logical internal, who is around locally that would make sense. It's part of my evaluation. So I get hit by the proverbial train, I guarantee you there's somebody internally, I will not be missed.
All right, we got it, Scott.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 quick questions. First, congratulations for having such a smooth and well thought out process. The first question is, do you always keep a candidate pool all the time? That's the first question. Okay. Second question is, because you're moving so smoothly, transitionally, the three of you moving through that, could be a double-edged sword, right? Without preventing any new CEOs to have innovative, transformative type of work, because they have to follow the other two. Thank you.
So the answer to the first question is basically yes, right? You always have an idea about who is potential both internally and externally within the organization. It never hurts to have a list, right? That list is changing. That's why we have this 6-month meeting, because it does change. Second item is actually much more important relative to the transition committee thinking. So again, I talked about the transition committee and the strategies behind the transition committee in terms of getting agreement within the committee about what it is that they want. And while we absolutely require Scott to identify folks who are available and to groom internal folks and to be investing in his people, we, as the transition committee, when we did this transition with Reed, we took the opportunity to really explore, do we want a real change agent, right? Why is not without its issues, as is every nonprofit organization. We do not want to give you the impression that we're in the world of sweetness and light, right? We have our problems just like every organization does. And the committee spent a lot of time, but you do that before you get to the people, right? So that you have an idea within the committee about what you want, because that will really start to tell you where you're going. If the committee is interested in a material change, right, you can reorganize how you're thinking about the kinds of candidates you want to interview and get there. And in fact, the competition for Scott was a guy who had done some significant changes in a different way, and he was a very capable candidate. So the good news is, and I want to make this clear to everybody, it's highly likely if you run a CEO transition process that you're going to get a wealth of good candidates. If you don't think about it ahead of time, it can be quite schizophrenic when you get down to the actual people, because your committee hasn't agreed on what is the actual criteria you're hiring for. So that's why I put that in that order, because yes, you can hire a change agent, all right, and that can be part of the pool of people that you're going to see. But if only 20% of your board is interested in a change agent, that can create a huge amount of disruption to your organization.
I think also it depends on the management style of the retiring CEO. I mean, if that person is a charismatic, highly directive leader who can influence the volunteers to hire a clone, then I think the point you're raising in your second question creates a risk. In our case, Jim and virtually all of the key volunteer leadership knew the fundamentals of the organization, its challenges, its opportunities, as well as I did. And I had created a staff who were not shy in expressing themselves and contributing their ideas, and I think the volunteers understood that. And so they weren't hiring a clone. Absolutely not. And if you know Scott and I, we share many things in common, but we're also very, very different. Not in a bad way, I might add.
Oh, there it is. Sorry. I'm just looking for where the mic is.
Good morning. I'd like
Morning.
to thank you and recognize that you've done an excellent job this morning. My name is John Green. I'm the chair of the Gift of Life Michigan, the organ procurement organization for the state of Michigan. I'd like to, and the professional in me, which is an executive search consultant, who was as the chair-elect, became the chair of the transition committee. You talked about the people side and the process side. Over this 8 to 9 month period, there's a plethora of logistics to manage. Did you all do that internally? As
So
ebbs and flows?
that, sadly, and I can tell you from experience, falls to the transition chair. So I apologize ahead of time. The transition chair really does need to run the process with a tremendous amount of vigor, Some flexibility, but the whole conversation about impressing upon your committee that they need to be responsive to the chair cannot be understated. These are all folks who have a lot of other things going on, and the logistics of driving meetings is a big pain. But as Scott said, and as Reed said, you need everybody to show up every time because you're making the most serious decision about the future of your organization. So the logistics are a huge pain. It's a lot of work. That's why I said, you take this job, you have taken a real, honest-to-goodness job on top of the one you already do.
Just again, to add to Jim's point, in the early part of the process, I provided some staff support. Once the committee began to identify candidates, we made a transition. The YMCA of the USA senior consultant came in to provide primary support, and I stepped aside. And that's, in my opinion, the way it should be.
Could you talk a little bit about the process for search firms identifying, interviewing, negotiating with, selecting, if you want to use a search firm?
So yeah, I have personally, I've always done this myself. It's the nature of the organizations I've done. So just some flavor for the ones that I've been a part of. I did Michigan Manufacturers Association, Junior Achievement, and the Y here. So, I can speak to it only on a observational basis, right? Search firms obviously are in this business. They can bring you a giant pool of candidates. I think that the reality is if you're in a 501c3 business, there's highly likely going to be people in the community who are interested in the job. Search firm will expand it, so instead of getting 150 resumes, you'll get 300 or 400. But the quality of folks available who are interested in this public service kind of work is quite heartening. That said, running your search firm is going to be a challenge. I happen to have just been called on one last week, so I'll give you my experience there. Right, a woman from Corn Ferry has called me and asked me about a particular job and said, who do you know who'd be interested? And I don't have anybody right off the top of my head, but I did give her some places to go in terms of, here are people who interact with folks in this market every day, right? So if I didn't have a search firm and I'm looking, right, I'm going to look for, first of all, I'm going to publish the job, and second, I'm going to look for and go to all the guys who run foundations and some of the ladies who run foundations in town, because they see each one of, or a big chunk of these organizations traipse through their door every day to ask for money, and they know who's good at it and who isn't. And so as you start talking to folks, that's another place I look for resourcing people. But sourcing people, was my big concern initially. In the case of the Y has its own internal sourcing process. But I'll tell you, once you publish that job, you will get inquiries from all over. It's remarkable where folks come from. Folks looking to relocate, folks looking to do various things. The other thing you need to remember is, because every single one of these organizations files a 990, the salary's right there on the page. So people who are looking for these jobs, if they know anything about nonprofits, know about where to find the information about the job and whether or not the salary meets their requirements.
Ben, if I could just on a personal level, as a CEO who look for a job, I'm going to respond very differently to a request from a search firm than I am from an organization. I like Jim, I have gotten many calls during my professional career from search firms. I typically don't respond to them. If I get a call from the CEO of the YMCA in Chicago telling me that he's going to retire in a couple of years, I'm going to probably have, well, I clearly haven't because I've been here for 23 years, but I'm going to respond to that a heck of a lot quicker than I am from a search firm in Chicago. That's personal. but I would imagine a search firm's going to scare up a totally different group of candidates than something with, you know, with the current CVO's name on it. So.
Thank you for this. It's been very informative. Can you talk a little bit about pre-process, perhaps an organization that isn't ready to go through a positive transition? I guess I'm thinking about maybe a CEO that...
I've done one. I've done one. So a lot of it depends on how much time you have or how bad is your cash burn, right? You know, here's... Yeah, you know, this is a key piece of information, right? So if you have what I would call a non-positive change, right, and they do exist, and they're almost always driven by one of two things: either the person involved has some kind of malfeasance, right, or they have become toxic to either the board or the staff. You know, I have seen it both ways, right? If you have time, what you want to do is figure out who on the board has the best relationship with your current person and encourage that person to have a conversation about, we need to create a retirement date. That's the best optics, right? And I've done that. If you have a malfeasance problem, you don't get a choice. You have, and all of you who are board members, your personal assets are on the line every day you serve in this job. Right? So if you know of malfeasance within your organization that especially involves financial malfeasance, you have an obligation to remove the CEO pretty quickly. Yeah. So in the case of the one that we had, right, we forced a retirement, but I've seen it done where the chief volunteer or the volunteer person figures out someone from the board to become the caretaker CEO while the process gets run.
Just again, to kind of add to that, I've not personally experienced that type of transition, but I've provided consulting support to two YMCAs where they went through that. I can tell you on a very pragmatic basis, I quickly identified someone within the organization who could be the interim. In one case, we then sought a retiree who had been relatively newly retired to step in to be the acting CEO until a search process could unfold. But I think both Jim and Scott mentioned you've got to have someone in that chair ASAP.
Nina?
Good morning. So in the scenario of a planned transition, once your search committee is formed and the announcement has been made, I'm guessing there could be a lot of uncertainty within the organization on the staff. So what are some tips to kind of managing your internal colleagues while you go through this process of finding a new leader?
So one of the advantages that we had at the Y was that the staff, I don't know whether it was an advantage or not, but the staff knew me, right? So they knew I was leading the transition, and that was a big advantage because anyone on the staff knew they could call me because I'd been in their committee for one reason or another through the organization in my life in the organization. Whoever is in charge of it, there's two things that need to happen. One, I think there's a real obligation after the announcement for the outgoing CEO to be as positive as they can be about the process to staff, right? Creating a lot of turmoil within staff is drama that your organization doesn't need. You're replacing the head of the organization. The last thing you need is lots of people heading for the exits. So from that perspective, what the outgoing CEO does is incredibly important. From the perspective of the transition committee and the board communication, right, the person who's heading the transition committee needs to be available to staff if they have questions, right? I probably talked to almost all of Reed's reports after, making sure that if they were interested in the job, understanding, where they felt they sat in the process, so that they felt that they had a communication channel. It's also quite defensive in the sense of rumors can get started, and if there are people who feel like they can call the transition committee chair and get an answer, you tend to squash the rumors much more quickly than you would otherwise. Let's go back here since the microphone's in the back, sorry.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. I do have a question related to the transition team and what role the mission and values of the organizations played in your selection of a new CEO. And I'm referring to the social network that was referred to in knowing people who might be a good fit for the organization, and what role diversity and inclusion from sexual, women, I know your mission involves family, people of color, different ages. Was that part of your criteria at all, and how was that implemented in the process?
So I would tell you that it was an absolute conversation in the process as we got started, right? And the committee spent a lot of time discussing what is the proper approach for that. At the end of the day, the committee decided in this case, and I think each committee will decide on its own merits, but the committee decided in this case that the issues and the challenges the organization were facing were the paramount issues. And we would be interested in anybody who came forward who had the skill set to address those issues. But we need to be careful about trying to select, given two things are equal, right, you'd want to be a more diverse organization. But if you have issues that you want to make sure get addressed, right, you got to be real careful about making sure you hire the most capable person. And the reason for that is that for the vast majority of not-for-profit organizations that I've been involved with, cash is a big deal. And if you don't have someone who really understands how the cash goes in and out, right, that's a huge problem. And so in this case, we spent a lot of time focusing on business acumen as being the highest priority item without ignoring the other issues. Because the why itself, and I'll let Scott give the advertisement for the why, is incredibly interested in what goes on in the community, as is the board.
So here's a second. So after I took the job, I think I realized that we probably could take some steps to look more like our community. If you look at our senior management team, and I purposefully, all of my direct reports now, we have a little more, we have more gender diversity certainly, and more racial diversity in the senior management team. And to that end, I have actually promoted one of our African American females to be incredibly involved in taking steps towards becoming a CEO. So as part of my evaluation with her each year, we sit down and I talk about, here are the people you need to talk to, here's who you need, here's what you need to be talking to them about, here are the various skills you're short in, and she's basically our chief development officer. Here are the skills you need to acquire so that when this happens, it happens seamlessly. But our senior management team right now, of the roughly 22 members of our senior management team, maybe 17 are female. And of that 17, probably half of those are African, or of, let me just say, of color. And that, I think that's critical. We've got to absolutely intentionally create the pipeline, which is one of the things we're doing.
Thanks for a great program, and this is a great opportunity. I'm going to return to a question about timing. My name is Bob Marion. I'm the president and CEO of Arbor Research Collaborative for Health. So we're a nonprofit research organization, and I've had the privilege of serving as the president and CEO there for about 9 years. I don't have any present plans to retire, but my hope is to retire from my job. From the CEO standpoint, so Scott and Reed, and then from the board chair standpoint for Jim, what is your advice about the timing of the CEO coming forward to divulge to the board chair and to the board their planned timing for retirement? Is it a bad thing to say, like Jamie Dimon did yesterday, I'm planning on being around for 5 more years, or is it better to just wait until you're kind of ready to go according to your succession plan and say, okay, we're now at time 0 on the plan and go forward? Appreciate your answers.
Yeah, it depends. and really, I've seen why, and realize I've spent my whole professional career in the YMCA, so that's my context. I've seen why CEOs give 2 years notice. I frankly think that's way too long. I gave to the key leadership heads up about a year before my retirement. If I were doing it again, and it's the only thing I would change or do different because I had a tremendous group of volunteers to work with, I'd probably do 6 months. It's amazing once you make that announcement how quickly you become the former CEO. And if you still have things you want to accomplish, you have to keep that in mind. I would, unless there's some intervening reasons to lengthen, the committee itself can get its work done in 6 months. And, that's my advice. But on the other hand, if you're in a situation where it'll take more time to surface candidates and all of those things, a year. But I have not seen, in my experience, the need to give notice longer than a year.
As a board guy, year is great, right? I would agree with Reed. In our case, we were efficient. We got a lot accomplished. So it could have been done in 6 months, no less than 6 months, right? If you're an organization that's run by volunteers and you're the CEO, you have to respect the fact that these folks have a day job and they need to do that too. And so you got to give them enough time to do that.
Let me add something to that. Reed and I have very little in common. We're both French-Canadian by heritage, but that's where it ends. There are a couple things that could impact that, okay? Do you have a real solid number 2 person who's going to be your best replacement, who, if you don't say anything, you're going to lose? Well, at that case, you may want to give a longer lead time, number 1. Number 2, I have different dialogue with the leadership than I have with the general public. So I have had many conversations with Jim and with other board members giving indications as to my timeline. I would certainly not have those levels of conversations publicly, but I owe it to him and to the volunteers to know that. I personally, 6 months to me is way too short. But again, he and I have very little in common. But 6 months to me is almost insulting the board.
We are coming up on time. 2 more questions, please, and then we'll stick around if you have things you want to come down and talk to us about. So we'll start up front.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I look forward to the resources. Any suggestions for recruiting for a non-salary leadership position?
So, it's actually in many ways a little easier. The non-salary job is you get to take pay out of the conversation, right? And it's about recruiting the folks. To me, if you're recruiting that, you're advertising the heck out of it if you don't have an internal candidate. You want to use your social networks and get out and talk to as many people as you can about the role and what's happening and what the timing could be, because look, being the CEO of a nonprofit organization has a huge psychic payoff. Right? It is not without its benefits from the perks of what you're able to do for the community. And some folks will do that work for zero. It's not necessarily as easy, but it's actually a lot easier to raise money when you can say you're not making any of it off of it. So this is my 2 cents.
Right. Toward the end of the PowerPoint presentation, you talked about community relation facilitation.
Yep.
So at this point, we've brought on the new CEO, and it may be the result of a national search or whatever, so they may come from another state or another area from within the state and not know the community they're serving in. So with regard to getting them acclimated to the appropriate relationships, would you have, before the current CEO totally leaves, have them facilitate the introductions, or does your transition team somehow set up those breakfast meetings, relationships with the program officers of the foundation to do all the introductions and all that? What process do you use for that?
So I'm going to borrow a comment from Reed and say it depends.
Okay.
But I would say the following. On terms of creating and doing those relationships, my philosophy, and this is, again, all advice is worth what you're paying for it, right? But my philosophy is that is the board's role, is to get this new person, wherever they're coming from, as integrated and connected to the community as they can be as quickly as possible. And then that means lots of breakfasts, lots of lunches, lots of dinners, right? If the CEO has particular relationships, and Reed certainly had some, then we want to be able to do those, but there's a natural tension with the old and the new. It's not always an easy transition. In this case, it's easier than most, but in general, the old CEO knows the new CEO is going to make changes. That's the nature of the thing, and sort of forcing high stakes meetings early on is something that at least I, as the transition committee chair, wasn't super in favor of.
Hold it the right way, sorry. I agree absolutely with Jim. Scott sometimes in our conversations would, you know someone at, and I'm making this up, at Skillman or at Kresge, and if I knew the person, I would try to also identify a volunteer on the board who also had a relationship. I don't think, I could be wrong, I never made any of those relationship introduction meetings with Scott. It was always, as both Scott and Jim had mentioned, a volunteer. And again, I'm having had a different experience in another association, I wanted to make absolutely certain there was no confusion as to who the new CEO was. And I was probably more paranoid about that than Scott, frankly.
Yeah, I would say always have a volunteer with you. I mean, if you're a CEO and you're going on any type of meeting like that, you got to have a volunteer, never by themselves. And that's I could go into chapter and verse, but John's staring at me, and I'll talk to you about it afterwards, but as a CEO, you always want a volunteer in every one of those meetings.
Well, thank you everybody for attending the session today. Jim, Reed, Scott, thank you very much. We will make sure that all the materials are available on the executive website, so you can go out there and get those. And one other reminder, we do have another session coming up on Tuesday, February 13th. We have Sherry Welch from Crane's Detroit Business will be here, talk about how to deal with the media, things of that nature related to not-for-profits. I think it'll be an interesting session. Hopefully we'll see you at that one as well. Thanks very much.